The list controls all inherit from the list control base class, which provides several properties. First is the auto postback property. This is a Boolean property that specifies whether or not a change to the selected item in the list causes a postback to the server. This doesn't apply to the bulleted list control, though, which has no value for this property. The items property gets the list of items in the list. You can use this collection to determine which items are selected in the list. The selected index property gets or sets the zero-based index of the selected items in the list. In a multi-select list, it returns the lowest index. The default is -1, which means that no item is selected. It also provides the selected item property. You can use this property to get the individual properties of a selected item. The individual items of a list control are actually objects. So this returns a reference to that object. If the list control allows multiple selections, selected item gets the properties of the lowest indexed item. The list control also provides two events. The selected index changed event occurs when the selection on the list changes and it's posted back to the server. The text changed event occurs when the text and selected value properties change. The nice thing about the list controls is that they mostly work the same way. Once you understand the code for one control, you'll understand the code for all of them. So let's see how these lists work. The list controls page displays instances of the various list controls. Definitely way more list controls than you're probably going to put on a typical page. But one of the things you can do is you can select in this drop-down list box the type of control that you want to modify, and you can add a new item in this text box. So let's see, all of the lists have apples, oranges. Okay, there's no lemons. So let's add lemons to the list box control. So I'll type in the text, click on the Add button, and now the lemons item appears within that list box control. And I can do that with any of the different controls. I can also do things like clear the selection, remove various items, in order to test out how these controls work. There are two general ways of adding items to a list. One is at design time. You can use the features of Visual Studio in order to pre-populate the list with items that display the first time the user looks at the page. You can also add items programmatically so that when the page is posted back, you can customize the list based on user selections. So I'll come over here to Visual Studio and open up the test page, and I'll go over to Design View. And I'll add a drop-down list control to the page. I'll just double-click on it, and I'll select Edit Items. That opens this List Item Collection Editor. I can click on Add, and I can set the text that will appear in the list for this item. And I'll select, something generic. How about widgets? I can also specify a value for the control, but by default, Visual Studio makes the value the same as the text that appears. But I can change this to an integer or any other value that I choose to represent widgets. I'll go ahead and add another one. I have lemons on the mind, so I'll go ahead and add lemons. And then I can continue to add as many other items as I want to within the dialog box. I'll go ahead and close that. And then I'll right-click on the page and view it in the browser. Prompts me to save. And I can see that under my Garish label control, I now have a drop-down list that is pre-populated with the items that I added within the dialog box. Even though Visual Studio provides that handy interface for entering items manually, probably more commonly you're going to need to work with list items programmatically, particularly to add them. So let me go back to my sample page. And notice that I have all of the controls listed in this list box. And I showed earlier how you can programmatically add, for example, the lemon items to the list box control. So let me go to the code that implements that. This is implemented within the Add button's click event procedure. The Add New Item method uses the list control retrieved by the getSelectedList method. And the getSelectedList method returns the selected list control that the user selected from that drop-down list. It uses in turn the findControl method that takes a string value that is returned by the value of the selected item of that list of controls and converts that into a control of type list control. So this is really hooking into the power of the object-oriented nature of the .NET framework. So once I have a reference to that selected list, I can pass that and the new text item here, where I put lemons, to the Add New Item method. The Add New Item method takes care of adding the new item to the selected list. In this case, remember, I was adding the lemons item to the list control. So it first checks to make sure that the text to add is not an empty string. Obviously, if it's an empty string, we have nothing to do. Then the code instantiates a new list item object. It passes into the constructor the text that we want to add, lemons, and then it checks to see whether or not the list already contains that specific item. And you can use the contains method in order to check that. Because for this particular application, we don't want to duplicate any of the existing items within the list. If contains returns false, then we go ahead and call the add method of the items collection in order to add it to the list specified. And remember that this list object is a reference to the selected list that the user chose within the drop-down list. When a user makes a selection to a list, you can either react to the selection immediately or wait for the next postback. If you've set the control's AutoPostback property to true, the control's selected index changed event handler runs immediately, after any page-level events are handled. If AutoPostback is set to false, then the code will run the next time the page is posted back to the server. And the page is typically then posted back to the server by some other control on the page, probably most commonly a button control. So in the sample page, I can check the Use AutoPostback checkbox here, and let's look at the code to see what that does. Here's the check-changed event procedure for that checkbox. And what it does is it calls the handlePostback method and passes in a Boolean based on whether or not the checkbox is checked. Here's that method, and as you can see, it simply sets the AutoPostback property for all of the sample controls on the page to the value of the checked property, whether or not enabled is true or false. And then it also toggles whether or not the Show Selected button is visible or not. If you want code to run when a user selects a value from a list or changes the value of any input control, you need to ensure that the AutoPostback property is set to true. But just remember that this causes a round trip to the server each time the user selects a value. And that can really slow down user interaction with your page. So just be careful and use the AutoPostback property sparingly and only with good reason. Another thing you need to deal with programmatically is working with the selections that the user has made to the list. For drop-down list and radio button list controls, the user can only select a single item at a time, and that makes it really easy to handle the selected index changed events. I don't have to worry about processing multiple selected items. So in the code, I'll go to the radio button list demo selected index changed event. And notice that all I need to do in order to display the selection within the appropriate label is just read the selected item's text property. There's only one potential selected item, and so I just copy over the current value to that. But it's an entirely different matter for list box and checked box list selections. For those controls, you need to check the selection mode property before taking any action. So let's look at the list demo selected index changed. And notice in the code, I'm checking to see whether or not the selection mode property is set to the single enumeration of the list selection mode enumeration. If it is set to single mode, then I do the same thing as the previous method and I just copy over the text of the selected item. Otherwise, I need to retrieve a delimited list of the selected items, and this becomes the text that is displayed within the label. I pass in a reference to the particular control, and then within that method, I loop through each of the items within that list control object and check to see whether or not it is selected. If it is selected, then I add that to my list of my text output. The end of the procedure just does a little bit of cleanup, stripping off any trailing semicolons. Now, in several of these methods, we've used the selected item property of the various list controls to retrieve the text of the selected item. If you need to know the position of the item that's selected, you can use the corresponding selected index property. This is a zero-based index that returns the position of the selected item within the list of items in the control. Very commonly, it's also necessary to clear the selection of a list, whether the list has selected one or many list items. One of the ways to do it is to write code to loop through the items collection of a control, checking the selected property of each object, and then setting each to false. But that's really too much work for such a common operation. So that's why each list control provides a clear selection method, so that you can clear all the selections with a single line of code. Here's an example of that. Remember that the getSelectedList returns a reference to the control that the user has selected in that drop-down list. Once we have a reference to that control, we just call the clearSelection method, and that takes care of clearing all of those selections. Another thing you can do is remove items from the control. The click event procedure of the Remove All button uses the items collections clear method in order to clear all of the items. Once you execute this method, the list control is empty. All of the items have been removed from the control. Both the clear selection and the clear methods simplify deselecting and removing list control items. One of the challenges in creating web applications is to enable users to work with your application smoothly and intuitively. This very often includes determining which control has the focus and trying to ensure that this is the control the user expects to have the focus. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten frustrated by going to a web page that has a form that I really want to fill out because I want the product or I want the information or whatever, but I have to grab the mouse and click in the first text box on the form. The challenge here is that HTML pages don't inherently support some of the behaviors that we expect from rich Windows applications, desktop applications. For example, when a web page opens, the default behavior is that no control has the focus. So the developers on those web pages that frustrate me just didn't take the time, the slight extra effort, to control the focus of the page. So in the past, it was necessary to write your own JavaScript code on client-side JavaScript to compensate for these HTML quirks and to provide a better user experience. But once again, ASP.NET makes our lives easier by allowing you to set simple properties or to call methods of server controls to generate the necessary JavaScript automatically. So let's see how it works. The sample application has a focus page that lets you see the ASP.NET focus behaviors. So I'll go ahead and right-click on this and View in Browser. And notice that right off the bat, the cursor is in the first text box. If you can see the cursor flashing right there. Now I'll use the drop-down list box here in order to set the focus to text box 3. And now you can see the cursor right here. I can also press Alt-L in order to set the focus to the drop-down list. I can also select Alt-S and the focus goes to the drop-down list box as well. Let me actually change the focus away from that, hit Alt-S once again, and the focus goes to the text box. The difference is that Alt-L is the access key for the drop-down list box itself, whereas Alt-S is the access key for the label associated with that drop-down list. And in fact, the tooltips tell you which Alt keys to use to set the focus to those particular controls. All right, I can go ahead and change this, say back to text box 1, and then I can press the Enter key. And notice that because this is the default button for the page posted back and displayed some information about what happened. If I go ahead and click on the button directly, it once again posts back, and I have the same text that appears. But if I instead move to this text box and put in some sort of a search phrase, I'll be egotistical today, and hit the Enter key, notice that it sees that I clicked the search button. So I can have default buttons set for different regions on the page. Now there's several different ways that you can implement these behaviors on the page. The page has two focus-related default values set at the form level. One of these determines that text box 1 retrieves the focus when the form opens, and the other sets the default button. So let's see how this works. I'll go ahead and open this up. And here are the two attributes that control those behaviors. So the default focus specifies that when the page loads, text box 1 gets the focus. Now, it's important to realize that this is the initial focus when the page is first loaded. Every time the page posts back, the focus is not changed back to text box 1. That would kind of defeat the purpose. The other attribute is default button, and this is the one that as long as the cursor is located within the form, then if I press Enter, I'm going to activate the click event procedure of that button. It's easiest to set these properties in SourceView because you can easily find and select the form tag. Remember that these are attributes of the form element here. And if you set them in the Properties window, then Visual Studio will insert the correct attributes into the form element. You can also deal with focus behaviors programmatically. So I'll open up the code window. And here's the selected index changed event for the drop-down list, the set focus drop-down list control. So the first thing it does is it finds the control. This again is a method that converts the text name of the control into a reference to the control. It assigns a reference to that control to a new object variable C of type control, and then calls the focus method of that control. Once again, this takes advantage of the object-oriented nature of the .NET framework. All of the server controls on the page ultimately derive from the control object. The control object has a focus method, so by defining an object variable of the control type, I can call that method no matter what type of control it actually is. You can also allow users to navigate around the page using the keyboard. And to do this, you can use the tab index and access key properties. By setting consecutive integer tab index values, you can determine which control receives the focus next when the user presses the tab key. In fact, this is another big potential annoyance. Have you ever gone to a web page at an e-commerce site, filled in some information in one text box on a form, hit the tab key, and are taken to an entirely different part of the form? Well, the reason for that is that the developer didn't pay any attention to the order of the tab index properties of the controls. The access key property lets you create keyboard shortcuts based on combining the Alt key with the letter of your choice. You just have to be careful not to use any of the predefined access keys that are defined by your browser. But most of the Alt key combinations should be available. Label controls also have an associated control property. When a user presses the access key combination that's defined for label control, the focus moves to the associated control. So that's what happened in the example page when I clicked the Alt-S combination. The focus actually went to the label, but a label control can't get the focus, so it went to the associated control, which was the drop-down list. So let's see how all that's defined. I'll go over to Design View. Makes it easier to find the code. Go back to Source. So here's the label for the drop-down list. Notice first of all that the access key is set to S. That's why when I clicked Alt-S, I went to the label control, ultimately to the drop-down list control, because the associated control ID attribute was set to the name of that drop-down list. And to make the user interface even friendlier, I have a tooltip that identifies which Alt key combination allows the user to set the focus. Similarly, on the drop-down list, I have the access key attribute set to L and a tooltip that identifies that Alt-L moves the focus to that control. So you can start to see how ASP.NET implements all of these behaviors by just setting properties and attributes of the various controls. But what about the case where you need to have multiple buttons on a page that respond to the Enter key? Users can be doing different things on the page, and different things should happen when they press Enter. So in the sample page, you saw how I put the cursor within a text box and pressed the Enter key, and that caused the click event procedure of the default button to fire. When I put the cursor within the search box and pressed Enter, an entirely different thing happened. The click event procedure of the search button fired. You can handle this by placing the control grouping on panel controls, which create div tags when rendered as HTML. Each panel can have its own default button set. So I'll go back over to Design View. And that's what's happening with this search phrase. It's contained within this panel. And if I now go over to the source, I can see that the default button attribute is set to the search button. That's why, as long as the cursor is within the text box, within that panel, when I press the Enter key, I'm going to get the click event procedure of that search button. Otherwise, if I'm anywhere else on the form, I'm going to get the default button for the form, and we saw the code for that a little bit earlier. Now in this particular example, the command event for each of the buttons on the form is handled by the same procedure. And the command argument for each button is set to a string that identifies the button. So this allows the single procedure to produce the appropriate message, no matter which button is clicked. So here's that event procedure. And that's how we get the text identifying that a particular button was clicked. As you've seen, there are lots of different ways to control the focus in the page. ASP.NET gives you all the tools you need in order to really enhance the user experience.